Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, everybody, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of The Art of Procurement. And this week, I'm joined again by Terri Gallagher. You might recall that Terri was actually on the show before, back in episode 20, and Terri and I talked about the role that procurement can play in the management of the temporary labour category. Just to recap, Terri is President and CEO of Gallagher & Consultants, and Gallagher & Consultants is an advisory firm that helps companies build and implement workforce management strategies. Terri really is an expert in the field of human capital management and specifically contingent or temporary labour. And Terri's previously been an executive of a number of leading service providers in the space, companies such as Adecco, Manpower and Tapfin. So when we first planned that show back in episode 20, we actually mapped out 3 different episodes to record, basically a series on the management of temporary labour. And that's something that I want to do on the Art of Procurement, is to have series around particular areas of spend. What we wanted to do, though, first is see how well the first show resonated before we got into the second and the third show in that series. So we're very fortunate, and the first show did very well. So if you haven't heard it, then you can actually go to artofprocurement.com/temporary labour to listen, and that's labour. Unfortunately for my listeners back in my homeland of the UK, that's labour, the American spelling, so that's LABOR, so temporary labour. Well, in today's show, we're actually going to shift gears and go a little bit deeper and talk in more detail about developing workforce strategies. And there's 4 areas that I think we get into in the show. First of all, we talk about the groundwork. So how do you start thinking about building a temporary labour strategy? That's really the legwork in defining your category strategy, essentially. We'll then look at some critical success factors for building a successful temporary labour program before considering how to go about selecting the right supplier partners. And as you'll hear, that can be an MSP, so an intermediary. It can be a VMS, which is a technology partner. And there's a couple of different firms that are emerging in that space too that you can think of. Finally, we'll look at how procurement leaders and category managers can actually ensure compliance with the program and drive the adoption that's necessary for the program that you've implemented to actually deliver the anticipated benefits. Okay then, so before we do get started, I wanted to let you know that if you haven't done so already, you can sign up to be notified every time that an Art of Procurement episode is published. You can just head over to artofprocurement.com/subscribe, pop in your email address, and you'll be sure never to miss another show. As a thank you for doing that, I'm going to send a couple of reports that are featured on the show, including our most popular download so far, and that's the 21 tips and tricks to help you secure your dream procurement job. So again, to sign up, it's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Okay, and there is one last thing. I'm always concerned that I repeat myself in the introduction that I'm doing here and the first few minutes of my conversation with a guest. And, I like to capture that first few minutes because it helps kind of build a connection between the guest and the listener. I think today, with Terri already being known to the Art of Procurement listeners, and with some of that background being available in the episode 20, I'm going to roll straight into the first question as we come out of the music. So with that being said, let's roll the bumper and go straight into that question. The first question really that I had is, what are the first steps or considerations that you really need to start thinking about as you build your strategy and build your program and really determine what your temporary labour or contingent workforce program should look like?
That's a great question. And, I think the first thing you need to do is, do you have a need? Mm-hmm. And generally one of the first questions I'll ask a client or a customer is, do you know how many temp contractors you have and how much you're spending? And if they say no, that's generally a sign that they definitely need a strategy. So determining the need means you don't have visibility to what that spend looks like. The systems and processes, may not be as robust as you would like for kind of managing that workforce. And then the other piece around the first step is you've really got to build a cohesive business case to get the attention of the key stakeholders and the C-suite that are going to be absolutely critical to driving that solution. So I think the first thing is determine that you have a need. And then, of course, once you have a need, some key steps would be, obviously do your research first, on the value of a workforce management solution. So the visibility, cost savings is obviously a key driver for procurement, improved quality, risk mitigation, total talent management. So how does this workforce fit into your total workforce? And then be able to articulate that value to the key executives that you're going to be involved with to implement these solutions, not only today, but 5 years down the road.
Right. And is there a minimum level of spend that you really need to have an ROI of looking into this category holistically, or should you think about it in a different way in terms of how you get an ROI again, essentially, on putting in place a workforce management strategy?
That's a great question, and there really is no minimum. As a matter of fact, a lot of the clients that I'm talking to now have lower spend thresholds. They may be 10, 15, 20, 25, 35 million. And a lot of the bigger players are kind of, ignoring those opportunities because of the way their models are structured. So the managed services providers tend to be very labor intensive. So there really is no minimum, but it's just a matter of how the solution is structured and making sure that you're being able to deliver that value with an operations model and a technology solution that not only works for the client, but is sustainable and profitable for the organizations providing those solutions. And I think the key is structuring it in a way that is very value add and very lean, and kind of taking out some of the more transactional roles that may not be necessary and could be executed another way.
And when you look at building a business case, is that typically a HR or a procurement conversation, or do you see both groups kind of partnering to do that?
Well, the ideal is to have, we talked about the key executives, so having HR and procurement being able to articulate the requirements, and then, of course, having the other players involved once you get into solutioning, like IT and your finance folks, and just having the right people at the table are really important.
And what's a good business case look like? So how do people make the case to their executives that there's a need to invest in the space?
That's another great question. I think you've got to look at how are you going to construct your workforce plan.
Yeah.
You've got to look at what players need to be on the journey. And I say that because if you don't have the right people up front that are on board and helping you construct this, it just makes it difficult to drive adoption and compliance. I think you've got to drive very clear objectives and targets. Each organization is different. So some of the basics, we don't know what we're spending. We don't know where these workers are. In manufacturing, we have a lot of turnover or a lot of accidents with our temp workforce in a particular location. So a lot of it's just we've determined a need, and we found some pain. And so we want to put some solutioning around that. And then I think the other thing is to define the future expectations and tell these key stakeholders where you're taking the workforce strategy next, what the payoff is. And the payoff is different for different people, right? They care about different things. Finance wants, they want to make sure that the cost accounting is going to be put into the technology system, and procurement wants cost savings. HR wants risk mitigation. So those are the types of things that you've got to be able to articulate. And then be educated on the obstacles and risks. Temp workforce strategy consultant can obviously help with that. I mean, I could help with that, or whoever you choose to bring in, but being able to put that case together is very important.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple of ways that you can actually measure success, or at least put in a business case some of the key targets that you're looking at. And I was interested in metrics. Is there any standard metrics that you see people use when they're making a business case, or standard targets that they use? Because as you mentioned, it means something different to different people, or different stakeholders have a different opinion of what success might look like, and what the business case for investment may look like.
Well, I think for the savvy procurement person, and we know everyone that's listening to this is, they've already done the research. They've talked to all the key stakeholders and find out, what those pain points are or what the objectives are. and then making sure that constructing metrics around that so that they can find ways to be able to articulate the value. And a good MSP provider or workforce intermediary, and we'll talk about who they are and what they do, can help with that. But, it's not really complicated. If you've identified the challenges, the key metrics are good data and analytics out of the technology provides the visibility. You reduce turnover, negative turnover. You see an improvement in quality. There are, surveys that can do that.
Yeah.
Setting realistic cost savings goals, are they met? So those are kind of the basics to start out with. And then once you get a program in place, you can evolve those metrics to be, more sophisticated and comprehensive.
You kind of got to start with something and then become more, as the program matures or your management of the program matures, you can get a little bit more complex.
Yeah, you definitely, it's a great question because you do need to be able to show value as soon as possible.
Right.
And so the quick hits are a good start.
So when you look at what a successful temporary workforce strategy and program should look like, what are some of the key success factors that really are driving a successful program?
Well, I think there's really three that come to mind, and I think the two main components, to kind of take a step back, what is a successful temp workforce strategy? It's usually made up of two components: the workforce intermediary, which I won't use these terms because I know that they can be people have different understandings of them, but that's the person kind of sitting in the middle. It could be an MSP provider, a managed services provider, it could be a staffing company, it could be the organization itself. A lot of organizations bring this in-house, but that sit in the middle between the technology component, which is the second piece, which could be a VMS, vendor management system, it could be a freelancer system, it could be a combination of systems. And, basically ensuring that the full life cycle from onboarding to offboarding goes smoothly. So those are the two key components, and they can be made up of different things.
To think about those components and apply them to, a single individual, so it makes it a little bit clearer. You may have an individual who's a freelancer you want to bring on board. Then you have an intermediary who are really responsible for helping select that individual and onboard them into your company. And then you have technology, which is your VMS, which kind of tracks what they do, how many hours they work. Is that kind of how it all fits together?
Yeah, exactly. So that workforce intermediary, it's kind of like if you picture a control tower at LaGuardia, right? They're the person sitting, watching the plane. So this is a person or company or ops model that's sitting in the middle between, working with the technology, working with the staffing community, ensuring that the metrics are being met, that they're performing, that you've got the right staffing model. So they're really the strategic advisors. They're the transactional people. They're the ones that make sure that all of the components move slow, are smooth. So you've got the technology, that the managers are happy. They're, working with procurement and HR. They're also the client-facing resource. So they're kind of sitting in the middle. And the most familiar model is probably the MSP, the managed services provider. But we're starting to see other companies where they just do it. They have their own model, their own ops model in-house. So obviously we talked about three success factors to a good strategy. And the first one, and this is actually pretty critical, that's why I put it number one, is selecting the right mix of technology and then the workforce intermediary, that control tower at LaGuardia, that ops model or that organization that's going to sit in the middle. And there's a lot of different choices. You can select an MSP provider who has their own technology. You could also look at a workforce intermediary that could be a staffing provider, it could be an MSP provider, it could even be a VMS provider. It just depends on whoever you want to have sit in the middle. And then the other piece of this is the technology solutioning. So you've got a vendor management system, which everyone is pretty familiar with, that manages from onboarding to offboarding and tracks metrics and data and ensures that you've got the visibility, and you can just do a myriad of reporting on all of the data points around your temp labor. But there's also so many other technology solutions out there. I mean, we're in the middle of a workforce strategy technology evolution. So you've got other workforce intermediary platforms that bring in freelancers. You'll see this in a lot of different organizations where they've got a high concentration of IT talent, and they need to really kind of expand their reach for multiple temp talent communities. You may need to consider another technology component if you've got a lot of shift work. There's actually other technology providers out there that can bolt on to a VMS system that are very specific around shift work. They can help track that. So the good news is the technology providers that are out there today are very open to integration. So kind of the old, the MSP/VMS model is really expanding to looking at, different technology solutions.
And so actually last week I was at a conference that focused on technology and procurement. And one of the things that was a takeaway for me from that conference was this idea of platforms and applications, and how, you may have a platform which brings everything together, but then you have apps that bolt onto that, meaning, you're not necessarily just buying one end-to-end technology suite anymore. You can actually buy things that do different things and have different specializations, but then you can integrate them so that for all intents and purposes, it looks as one, but it allows you to be a lot more flexible in terms of the tools that you can use. And so is that something that you're seeing in the temporary staffing arena?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even the VMS providers, they're really upping their game, so to speak, and adding mobile capabilities. They've got some pretty robust data and analytics. And then you've got, other technology providers that can very easily bolt on to some of these other systems that have access to a completely different temp talent community that doesn't even involve the staffing community, right? It's just kind of connecting that talent directly to the end user. So there's definitely a lot of options there, to your point.
And how are the traditional technology providers taken to that? I guess the days are going where it's just a VMS or a vendor management system. It's one thing that and one company that supports you. Now there's multiple companies that can do it. Are the traditional VMSs open to that integration? Are they kind of fighting their turf? What's the industry look like right now?
That's a great question. Some of them are now partnering with other freelance systems. You've got Beeline with OnForce, and then you've got there's just a bunch of them out there. I'm not particular to anyone, but some of them are partnering. Some of them are trying to work with other freelancer systems and at least integrate them into programs. You've got MSPs that are trying to integrate Upwork without necessarily an integration, but it's not been moving, I think, as quickly as the technology revolution is moving.
Yeah.
I feel from what I've seen that there's an opportunity to expedite some of that integration and some of those open platforms because now clients are just bringing on board freelancer systems standalone, because they want access to. We're in the middle of a talent war, and it's just going to get worse. They want access to those multiple temp talent communities. And if you can't integrate quickly with that, the client may get ahead of you.
And it's funny you say that the technology is moving faster than our ability to integrate with it, because that's something that I see as well. And there's another takeaway for me from this conference was that the technology already exists for us to do so much cool stuff. But, it's hard to change. It's hard to keep up. And also, you don't necessarily want to go and make an investment. And in 6 months' time, there'd be something completely new that kind of changes the model and leaves you hanging with something that was new technology 6 months ago, but it's not so much now. So there's a lot of volatility. But I see that with procurement technology as well, that it's hard to put a stake in the ground and change. When technology really exists already out there for us to do things differently.
Well, I think it's like anything. Again, the savvy procurement leader is going to have the right people at the table, including their technology people in the beginning, to make that decision, to help make that decision. And then the other piece is having the right expertise to make a technology decision. The managed services providers are not necessarily the right people to have at the table to talk about what technology solutions would make the most sense. I have a client I'm actually going to see next week, and they've already got Oracle implemented for their temp talent, and it's not maybe the ideal solution, but they don't want to rip that out and do something else. And so it's really just kind of taking a look at what do they already have in place. And some of it might just be changing processes, rather than bringing in new technology. But you absolutely have to have the right expertise at the beginning and the right people at the table to make the decision on both sides.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that the MSP isn't necessarily the right source to make technology recommendations. So do you recommend that organizations look at the two very separate decisions, separate buying decisions? Or you still need a couple of solutions that will integrate with each other, but not necessarily taking the recommendation from the MSP, kind of figuring it out yourself or with an expert in the field?
Exactly. I just think that in that, thank you, perfect segue into success factor number 2. I think the key is to have the right players at both sides of the table. So on the customer side, the client side, through the RFI and the solution and the implementation and ops model, you should make sure you've got your HR person there, procurement, financial, and then the technology representation, because they will need to be involved with whatever is going to be implemented. Now, the technology providers have resources and methodology to make it fairly smooth, but you're still going to have to bring in the technology side with the client. And then, the other piece is having the right expertise on the other side, having the right players involved. You've got to have somebody who's a client steward that is going to be representing that client. You've got to have a workforce strategist, somebody that has that expertise, somebody that has the technology expertise to help you make the right decision. But the best decisions come collaboratively. And I think, just some of the challenges when they go to an MSP and just say, fix this for us and make all the decisions, they're not really, the ideal decision makers. Right. You've got to have the right people there.
Yeah, and also you got to take responsibility for change yourself.
Absolutely.
And not necessarily, this is an issue that I've seen in procurement and in procurement outsourcing, where companies will outsource their procurement organization or function or part of it, and then expect that service provider to be responsible for driving the change necessarily to be successful. And I've never really seen that work.
No, it doesn't. And it's really not fair to the MSP or the workforce intermediary or whoever is involved. It is a collaborative process. So
you talked about all the different players who are involved internally. Who's typically the decision maker?
So that's a great segue into success factor number 3. I think it's understanding the unique needs of the company and the goals and having the right players. So the decision maker is usually the best ones are multiple. It's the ones that have the most vested interest in success. So it's typically procurement. They tend to carry the most weight. I see this in manufacturing. If you've got different plant managers that are responsible for a tremendous amount of labor, they definitely need to be there because they've got to be on board and they've got to, you've got to make sure that they're happy with it. But typically, I don't see a lot of like CFOs and CEOs. I think eventually they sign off and you need to let them know what's going on. But the bulk of the decision is made with the HR and procurement executives, technology executives, and finance executives.
Okay. So what are some of the considerations to kind of determine what success looks like?
That's a great question. What's kind of funny is a lot of people don't know what a successful program looks like. Right. And so that's what got me thinking about that. And some of the key success factors is high adoption. If you've got everyone logging into this system and the technology and they're using it and they're happy with it, that's really important. Obviously, whatever quality metrics you set up, around cost, quality of worker, compliance, risk mitigation, you've got high scores on that. And of course, those, the MSP or whoever you bring in to help you with this can help you set up those metrics. Consistent executive sponsorship and stakeholder buy-in, even though that CFO and CEO might not have been there at the table, they definitely need to hear good things from the field. If they don't, you've got an issue. Yeah. So they're still very important. Continuous business process improvement, having good, strong data and analytics, that really provide growth strategies, help with workforce planning. And this is really important, and it's so rudimentary, user-friendly. Do people like working with the technology? Are they using it? Because if they don't, they're not going to use it. Right. And that's a whole other story. The other piece is seamless global workforce strategy. So for multinational clients, one of the things that my company is doing is we typically partner with other global workforce intermediaries for solutioning because they just understand the regulatory requirements and labor law, taxation. That's really important. And then the ability, once the program evolves, to evolve it into total talent management. That's something everyone talks about, but very few people are doing it. It might be a bit aspirational, but it's really just, how do we integrate the temporary workforce into our workforce strategy planning? And that's usually 2 or 3 years in. You're not going to see that year one.
So what does total talent management look like then? I was just interested to understand really what that means.
You know what? That's a great question because not too many people have it. It really is just being able to look at your full workforce, your full, whether it's temp or ICs or gig workers, perm labor, and being able to make strategic decisions around your total workforce. So having visibility around your total workforce, all the basics, your spend, but also just having a strategy around how do you leverage your total workforce for, bottom line results, and what does that look like?
And so you're ready to go to market to find an intermediary or to find a technology partner. And I'm guessing you'd go to market for the two at the same time, would you? Or
generally, if an organization doesn't have anything in place, they will. It depends on how mature they are. Now, some decide to bring the management piece, the workforce intermediary piece in-house. And so they would go and look at technology. But generally speaking, you want to pick them.
You got the same time.
Same time. Yeah, because you can't have one without the other.
Right. And so when you do, what are some of the key considerations then for selecting the right partners?
Well, I think that, definitely do your homework on what different options are available from a solution standpoint. And then, because it's more work, but then it's going to make you a very savvy buyer, right? So being aware of what your company goals are, you're going to get those from your stakeholders, you've gathered from them, and then incorporate that into the discussion. So you want to look at when you start talking to different workforce intermediary providers or consultants or MSPs or RPOs, you want to make sure that they're going to be able to offer the right resources to ensure a successful end-to-end solution. So you want to talk about their project management. You want to talk about, training, communications. They should be able to articulate what that looks like. And they should be able to counsel you on how to navigate the process internally and gain sponsorship with key stakeholders. This is something they should have expertise around. Some other things you want to look at is the operations model. Once it's implemented, which again, it's that control tower at LaGuardia, ask about the resources that are going to be available. So you want to make sure that you're going to have the right resources available in that operations model that's working with the technology and your managers and making sure that this is all going smoothly. And you want to make sure it's going to include dedicated technology and implementation support. So not somebody that's spread across 20 different programs, but somebody that's going to be dedicated to you as a client to not only make sure that the implementation goes well, but roadmap strategy and making sure you've got the right mix of technology. You've got to have dedicated data and analytics expertise. Again, somebody that's not spread across 20 programs and somebody that truly has business analysis expertise to deliver that more value add big data that everyone says that they want, and not just spitting out numbers and spend and headcount, but being able to provide a strategic view on what that data is saying. And I will tell you, a lot of the providers out there kind of skip over those two roles, and it's really important. Yeah,
it's turning that data into what's basically actionable intelligence rather than just giving you an Excel report of numbers.
Exactly. The other piece is the technology needs to fit your unique company and goals, infrastructure. If you've got a lot of shift, for like the manufacturing sector, it's got to have very robust shift differentials and be able to accommodate that. If you're a multinational company, making sure that the technology can accommodate different currency rates and VAT tax, and what does that look like? Does it have, and is it willing to integrate with other technology solutions? Say 2 or 3 years in, you're saying, I'd love to bring in Upwork, or I'd love to bring in Freelancer. Are they open to that, and are they willing to do that? Or, some of these that might have a partnership with another provider may push that provider, and you've got to make sure that they're open to working with other providers. And I've seen that happen where they're not necessarily open. And then, the last piece is really just build the key deliverables into the contract. You've already determined what your key deliverables are, and making sure that you ask for that commitment and factors that enable a successful launch. If there's a way you can articulate adoption, or measure that, or change management. I think it's really important and that they're comfortable with that. And a lot of times when people are eager to get an implementation in, they'll put speed ahead of prudence.
Right. And
it's worth taking the time to make sure that, everybody is on board with what the expectations are.
Yeah, we talked change earlier, and I mean, you only get one shot. And that's when you're beginning and when you're implementing your program. If it's kind of a debacle because you rushed it, then no matter how good your solution is or how good the strategy is, it's really difficult to win back the hearts and minds from a difficult launch. So you talked about, how important building key deliverables into the contract are, and something I was interested in is, you're obviously dealing with, at a minimum, an intermediary, so an MSP plus a technology provider, the VMS. So you've at least got two parties typically involved.
Right.
How do you make sure, and they're going to be reliant upon each other. So how do you make sure that when something goes wrong, they don't just stand and point fingers at each other, that it's kind of aligned? Well,
I think it's important to have the right players at the table from your organization, having that technology person, having all of the key players on board. As far as, making sure that the two are on board, I think it's important to, bring somebody in that understands how the two work together. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times, depending on what workforce intermediary you decide to use, they're not always going to have the expertise. So sometimes an outside consultant can help with that piece. I'm not just plugging myself here, but there's lots of that do that and can be that client steward that we talked about earlier, to kind of have that vantage point of looking at both sides and making sure things are heading the direction that they need to.
And are there some kind of key warning signs as you go through the RFP process that maybe a supplier isn't for you, they may not be interested in your business? What are some of the red flags that you sometimes see?
That's a great question. I think, probably the biggest is they're not listening to you, mm-hmm. and they're just kind of trying to move forward towards implementation. Or if you bring up something that you want to see in the contract, or you ask a question and you don't feel like you're getting a really comprehensive answer. So I think, the biggest red flag is they're in a hurry.
Right.
And they're not respecting your questions and not giving you the time needed to give you an answer back. I think the second piece is not being able to articulate exactly how they're going to be able to support your organization from an ops model and, mm-hmm. and who's going to be in the ops model, how they're going to work with the technology provider. A red flag with the technology provider is not asking the right questions around what other integrations do you have? What does your finance system look like? If they don't ask those questions, you're going to have a whole lot of hurt once you implement.
Mm-hmm. And I can't believe that we've actually spent so much time today already talking through this. I'll just kind of keep it to a last question, and that's you've picked your service provider or service providers. You're going through the implementation of the program. You're all set to go. Then it becomes about adoption and compliance. So what role can procurement play in really helping to maintain or to build high adoption rates with the program, which is really what you need to make it a success?
That really is the key, the number one key metric. I've said this a couple times already, but I'll say it again, ensuring the right players are at the table from your organization at the beginning to design this implementation. So not only from the organization side, but also from the technology and workforce intermediary side, so that what is designed is as solid as it can possibly be. Again, I've always said, take care of things at the beginning of the work stream rather than further down where you've got more pain points. And then level set expectations with the organization regarding benefits, timeline, be honest about disruption. There's always going to be a little bit of disruption when putting in a new system. So don't pretend that this is going to be the silver bullet for all the problems. I've seen that happen. And then really just hold the outside parties accountable, provide you a realistic timeline, provide the risks, the training, the communication strategy, the integration strategy where needed. And then, let them tell you, the workforce intermediary or the consultant, whoever you decide to go to, let them give you guidance on mm-hmm. which players on your side you need to involve. And then make sure that your contract emphasizes key deliverables. I mean, it doesn't have to be the Magna Carta, but it definitely has to have some of those key deliverables that are important to your organization.
Awesome. Well, Terri, we're coming up against time. So first of all, I just wanted to thank you very much again for being on the show today. I think that it's kind of a really interesting next step into looking at how you can build a program once you've figured out that a workforce management program is something that will make sense for you. And actually, we kind of have a third show in the works that we'll hopefully get out in a few weeks' time, which goes one step further and talks about the future. Because you mentioned earlier how much there's changed. Things are evolving. Different models are coming, especially with the freelance economy kind of growing and growing as it is. So things don't stand still in the temp labor space right now, that's for sure.
No, they don't. It's absolutely all about evolution. And, what we talked about today, that it was with keeping that in mind and looking at, bringing in different players that make sense for where the workforce is today, not 20 years ago.
Right. Well, I'm going to include some show notes from today's episode along with links to Terri if you would like to connect directly with Terri. And they're all going to be at artofprocurement.com/workforce strategy. And that's all one word. So that's artofprocurement.com/workforce strategy. So Terri, thank you again. And I can't wait until we reconnect for the third show in a few weeks' time.
Thank you, Phil. And thank you to the listeners. It's been great spending time with you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.